The end of the Second World War brought different fates for the brutal and diabolical Nazis. Today, you will learn the story of the executions of the 10 men condemned at Nuremberg, carried out by the United States in October 1946. The executioner, Sergeant John Clarence Woods, sabotaged the executions to prolong the suffering of the condemned Nazis. We will go through each of these stories and stay until the end, because what they did to the second-to-last man on the list will scare you. Forming the tribunal. Between November 1945 and October 1946, the International Military Tribunal brought together in the city of Nuremberg representatives of the greatest Allied powers of the time: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. Before them stood some of the most powerful men of the Third Reich who had survived the war. For the first time, the leaders of a defeated nation would be judged before the entire world for crimes against humanity. Not because they had lost a war, not for political reasons, but for the atrocities committed against millions of people. The tribunal became a true parade of horrors. Witnesses came through those doors every day: survivors of the concentration camps, Allied soldiers, civilians, doctors, former prisoners. Films shot by the Allies themselves and the newly liberated camps were shown before the judges. Piles of bodies, crematorium ovens, execution rooms, corpses scattered through mass graves across Europe. For the first time, the world was seeing the true scale of what had happened inside the Nazi extermination machine. And the defendants. Many insisted the evidence was false. Others claimed they did not know what was happening in the camps. Some repeated the same defense again and again. They were only following orders. The tribunal believed none of them. After nearly a full year of trial, interrogations, and testimony, the sentences were finally announced. 12 Nazi leaders were sentenced to death by hanging. 2 would escape the gallows, but they would not escape fate. The men who escaped their sentence: Hermann Göring, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, was also sentenced to death. For years he had commanded the Luftwaffe, helped create the Gestapo, and taken a direct part in consolidating the Nazi regime. To many Germans, Göring was seen almost as Hitler's natural successor, but he would never allow anyone to put a rope around his neck. On the night before the execution, guards found Göring dead in his cell. Beside the body was a small cyanide capsule. To this day, no one knows with absolute certainty how the poison got to him. Some believe the capsule had been hidden for months. Others claim he received help from an American guard. There are also accounts saying that Göring had planned it from the very beginning of the trial. Another condemned man would also never step onto the scaffold: Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and one of the most influential figures in the Nazi inner circle. He was sentenced to death in absentia. At the time, it was believed that he had managed to escape Berlin. Years later, it was discovered that Bormann had probably already been dead since May of 1945, during the desperate attempt to flee the ruins of the German capital. With Göring dead and Bormann absent, 10 remained, and all of them would eventually find themselves face to face with John Woods. And who exactly was he? Stay with me. The executioner. John Clarence Woods was a sergeant in the U.S. Army, but before that he had built his entire career on lies. When he applied for the post of military executioner in 1944, he claimed to have previous experience with executions in Texas and Oklahoma. He said he had already taken part in hangings and that he knew exactly how a gallows worked. It was all a lie. At the time some of the executions he claimed to have witnessed took place, Woods was still practically a child. There was no record of any kind to prove he had experience as a professional executioner. In reality, he had probably never even operated a gallows before joining the army. But that was the end of the war. The U.S. Army needed someone for the job, and Woods's background was never investigated in any depth. So he got the position. Over time, Woods began to show strange behavior toward the work. Some soldiers who served with him said he seemed to enjoy the fame the executions brought him. And when he found out he would be responsible for the executions of the Nazi leaders in Nuremberg, Woods decided to prepare something special. Normally, in a hanging, the rope length was calculated according to the condemned person's weight and height. The intention was to break the neck immediately at the moment of the drop, causing a quick death. But the executions that dawn would not happen that way. According to several later accounts, Vols had used ropes shorter than recommended. Some historians believe this was deliberate. Others say he was simply incompetent. The condemned men would not die instantly. Many were left hanging for several minutes, slowly suffocating before the Allied officers, military doctors, and witnesses present at the prison. It was the kind of detail John Woods seemed to appreciate. And that dawn, 10 men discovered it in the worst possible way. Before we continue with each of the executions, let me ask you one quick thing. If you're enjoying this content, leave the comment, "I want more stories," down below. It only takes a second, and it really helps the channel, okay? Also, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a like. We post new videos every week. First to be executed, Joachim von Ribbentrop. The first man taken to the scaffold that early morning was Joachim von Ribbentrop, former foreign minister of the Third Reich. Before the war, Ribbentrop had been one of the most important figures in Nazi diplomacy. He was the man who represented Hitler to the world. He took part in negotiations, agreements, and alliances that helped clear the way for Germany's military expansion across Europe. His name became especially linked to the non-aggression pact signed between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939, an agreement that made the invasion of Poland possible and accelerated the start of the Second World War. During the trial at Nuremberg, Ribbentrop tried several times to shift all responsibility onto Hitler, but at the same time his loyalty to the regime remained evident to the very end. At one point in the courtroom, he made a statement that impressed even some of those present. He said, "Even if I knew everything I know today, if Hitler appeared in my cell and gave me an order, I would carry it out without hesitation." The sentence made it clear that even in the face of all the evidence shown at Nuremberg, Ribbentrop was still bound to the figure of Hitler. And then came the early hours of the 16th of October, 1946. It was exactly 11 minutes past 2 when guards led him to the gallows set up inside Nuremberg prison. Before he died, Ribbentrop said, "May God protect Germany. I hope my country regains its unity and that, for the sake of world peace, understanding may be reached between East and West." Seconds later, the hatch opened, and John Woods' rope began to do its work. Second man executed, Wilhelm Keitel. The second man led to the scaffold was Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the High Command of the German Armed Forces for virtually the entire Second World War. Keitel had stood at Hitler's side since the early years of the conflict and signed some of the most brutal orders issued by the Nazi regime, including decrees authorizing the summary execution of prisoners of war, violent repression against civilians, and operations carried out completely outside international law. At the tribunal, Keitel admitted that many of those orders were illegal, but his defense always revolved around the same justification: absolute obedience to the Führer. According to him, a German officer could not disobey Hitler's orders, regardless of the consequences. Even so, Keitel tried to preserve at least one final image of himself as a soldier. Before the execution, he asked to die before a firing squad, but the tribunal refused. When his turn came, he walked to the scaffold, maintaining a certain military bearing. Witnesses said he still tried to show firmness in front of the American guards. Shortly before the hood was placed over his head, he spoke his last words. "I ask Almighty God to have mercy on the Germans. More than 2 million of our soldiers marched to their deaths for their fatherland. Now it is time for me to follow the same path." Then came the drop. Keitel was a tall, heavy man, and the space of the trap door did not seem suited to his size. When it opened, his head struck the side of the structure violently before the rope had fully tightened. The impact opened wounds immediately. Instead of dying instantly, Keitel agonized, hanging from the gallows as he was slowly strangled. According to some accounts from those present that dawn, the execution was one of the most brutal of the entire sequence. Third man executed, Ernst Kaltenbrunner. The third was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer to survive the war and be tried at Nuremberg. Tall, cold, and known for the deep scar on his face, Kaltenbrunner had become one of the most feared figures in the Nazi security apparatus. After Reinhard Heydrich's death, he took command of the RSHA. It was a vast structure that controlled the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, the SS intelligence service, and much of the regime's repressive machinery. In practice, his name became directly linked to the concentration camps, the deportations, and the mass executions carried out by the Nazis in the occupied territories. The gas chambers, the death squads, the brutal interrogations, and the camps spread across Europe operated under the system he helped command. During the trial, Kaltenbrunner tried to defend himself, saying that many of the atrocities had happened without his direct knowledge. At several points, he tried to distance himself from the extermination orders and place responsibility on subordinates or other SS leaders. The judges did not believe him. The evidence presented by the Allies showed his deep involvement in the structure of Nazi terror. And even in the face of all that, Kaltenbrunner showed virtually no remorse. Shortly before the execution, he made a statement that many present considered absurd. Instead of speaking about the millions of dead or the crimes committed by the regime, he lamented the fact that the German armed forces had been commanded, in his view, by men without sufficient military experience. When his turn came, Kaltenbrunner walked to the gallows, trying to maintain the rigid bearing he had displayed throughout the trial. Nuremberg. The fourth man to be executed was Alfred Rosenberg. Alfred Rosenberg was different from most of the men tried at Nuremberg. He did not command armies on the battlefield, did not lead military divisions, and did not appear before the cameras with the same imposing presence as figures like Göring or Keitel. But in some ways, his influence on the regime ran even deeper. Rosenberg was considered the chief ideologue of Nazism. He was the one who helped turn extremist racial theories into a kind of intellectual foundation for the Third Reich. For years, he wrote speeches, articles, and books trying to justify ideas of racial supremacy, anti-Semitism, and political persecution as if they were scientific or historical concepts. His most famous book, The Myth of the 20th Century, became one of the most important works within the Nazi apparatus. Many of the ideas that would later be used to justify persecution, deportations, racial laws, and eventually genocide itself were there. Rosenberg did not directly command the executions, but he helped build the worldview that allowed them to happen. During the trial, Rosenberg remained aloof and cold most of the time. Unlike some defendants who tried to mount long defenses or justify their actions, he seemed almost emotionally detached from what was happening around him. And when the time finally came for him to face the gallows, an officer asked whether he had anything to say before the execution. Rosenberg replied with a single word: "No." Then he climbed the steps to the scaffold in silence. A few seconds later, the trapdoor opened. Fifth to be executed, Hans Frank. Of all the men condemned at Nuremberg, Hans Frank was perhaps the only one who showed anything remotely resembling remorse. He had been the Governor-General of Nazi-occupied Poland during the war. In practice, he administered a territory ravaged by German terror, where millions of Jews were persecuted, deported, and murdered. Under his authority, ghettos were expanded, mass deportations took place, and the Nazi occupation machine operated with extreme brutality. He himself went so far as to describe occupied Poland as a German colony. But there was something that made Hans Frank different from the other defendants. While many tried to destroy evidence or deny any involvement, Frank handed over his own personal diaries to the Allies. Thousands of pages written in his own hand, recording meetings, decisions, orders, and comments about the Nazi occupation. The documents ended up becoming one of the most important pieces of evidence used by the prosecution at Nuremberg. In a way, Hans Frank helped convict himself. During the trial, he also showed unusual reactions compared with the other Nazi leaders. When the films and photographs of the concentration camps were shown in court, witnesses said Frank appeared genuinely shaken. At times he lowered his head, and at others he avoided looking at the images. This did not erase his crimes, but it made him a strange exception among men who, right up to the very last moment, insisted on denying or justifying everything. In the final days before the execution, Frank showed renewed interest in the Catholic faith, spoke with priests inside the prison, and began talking frequently about guilt, judgment, and forgiveness. When his turn came to be executed, witnesses reported that he seemed calmer than many of the other condemned men. He even smiled discreetly at some American guards and thanked them for the way he had been treated in prison. He said he felt relieved. Shortly before the execution, he spoke his final words, "May God have mercy on my soul." Sixth to be executed, Wilhelm Frick. The sixth man was Wilhelm Frick, and according to several accounts from that dawn, he was also the most terrified of them all. Frick seemed completely consumed by fear. During the walk to the gallows, he stumbled several times. At moments, he looked on the verge of fainting. But what exactly was his role? Well, he was one of the figures who helped legally build Hitler's dictatorship. Frick took part in drafting the Enabling Act of 1933, which effectively destroyed German democracy by granting almost absolute powers to the Führer. He was also one of the central figures behind the Nuremberg laws, the set of racial laws that stripped German Jews of their civil rights. Basically, he worked behind the scenes in government with paperwork, a pen, and official seals. He helped turn persecution into law. When he reached the top of the platform, his feet stumbled once again. The fear now seemed impossible to hide. Seconds later, the trap door opened, and all the bureaucracy he had helped build was unable to save him. The seventh to be executed was Julius Starr. Julius Starr was not a general, did not command troops, never led military invasions, nor did he take direct part in the strategic planning of the war. But the tribunal concluded that he had played a fundamental role in something equally dangerous, preparing millions of people to accept hatred as something normal. For years, Streicher ran the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, one of the most violent and extremist publications in all of Nazi Germany. The paper was essentially a propaganda machine built on humiliation, conspiracy theories, and the dehumanization of Jews. Its covers displayed grotesque caricatures. Its articles openly encouraged persecution. Long before the Holocaust began, Streicher was already publicly arguing that Jews should be eliminated from German society. For that reason, at Nuremberg, the judges concluded that he had helped create the atmosphere of fanaticism and hatred that made genocide possible. Even during the trial, Streicher continued to display absolute fanaticism. In one of the court's most tense moments, he shouted, "Heil Hitler!" To the very end, he seemed incapable of abandoning Nazi ideology. And when the early hours of his execution arrived, the situation became even more disturbing. On the gallows platform, Streicher again cursed the Jews and made anti-Semitic statements, even with the noose already in place around his neck. Witnesses reported that he alternated between moments of rage, hysteria, and emotional loss of control. Then the executioner pulled the black hood over his head. The trapdoor opened. Instead of dying instantly, Streicher remained hanging there, slowly suffocating in front of the witnesses present at the prison. According to several reports from the time, it was the longest and most agonizing execution of that entire dawn in Nuremberg. Eighth to be executed, Fritz Sauckel. The eighth man led to the gallows was Fritz Sauckel. Of all the leaders tried at Nuremberg, Few were as directly connected to the slave labor system created by the Third Reich. At the time, Sokol held the post of General Plenipotentiary for labor deployment. In practice, he was the man responsible for supplying the German war machine with workers forcibly taken from territories occupied by the Nazis. And he did it on a massive scale. Millions of people were torn from their homes in countries such as France, Poland, the Soviet Union, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Many were sent to German factories, mines, farms, and military installations, men, women, and even teenagers. The conditions were brutal. Many died far from home, treated as disposable parts of German industry. During the trial, Sokol tried to defend himself by claiming that he was only following orders and that foreign labor was necessary to keep the economy running during the war. But the evidence showed mass forced deportations and inhuman conditions overseen by the system he commanded. Even so, until the very end, Sokol refused to admit guilt. When he reached the gallows, he still insisted on his own innocence. Shortly before the execution, he declared, "I die innocent. My sentence is unjust. God protect Germany." Those were his last words. Seconds later, the trapdoor opened. Ninth to be executed, Alfred Jodl. The ninth man led to the gallows was Alfred Jodl, head of the Wehrmacht operations staff, Nazi Germany's armed forces. During the war, Jodl was among those most responsible for the military planning of the Third Reich. He worked directly alongside Hitler and took part in important strategic decisions at virtually every major moment of the conflict. His name also appears in connection with extremely brutal orders signed by the German command, including decrees that authorized summary executions of political prisoners, reprisals against civilians, and measures that completely ignored international conventions of war. Documents signed by Jodl also helped support deportations and operations carried out in territories occupied by the Nazis. At the tribunal, he tried to defend himself in the same way as several other German officers. He said he was a professional soldier, that he obeyed superior orders, and that he had no political control over the regime's decisions. Like Wilhelm Keitel, Jodl asked to be executed by firing squad. The request was denied. In the tribunal's view, he would not die as a simple soldier, but as one of those responsible for the crimes committed during the war. When the early hours of the execution arrived, Jodl still tried to maintain a firm bearing before the guards and witnesses present at the prison. Shortly before his death, he spoke his last words, "I salute you, my Germany." Years later, Jodl's name would once again become a source of controversy. In 1953, during a denazification proceeding in West Germany, a German court decided to partially review his case and concluded that he had acted mainly as a professional military officer within the war's command structure. Many ended up interpreting that decision as a kind of posthumous acquittal, although it remains a matter of historical debate to this day. But in Nuremberg, on that October dawn in 1946, there was no reprieve. The 10th man executed, Arthur Seyss-Inquart. By the time the last name was called, it was almost 5 in the morning. The executions were nearing their end. Seyss-Inquart had been a key figure in the Nazi expansion across Europe. He first took part in Germany's annexation of Austria in 1938, becoming Austrian Chancellor for a brief period just before the Anschluss. Later, he held administrative posts in occupied Poland and was then appointed Reich Commissioner for the occupied Netherlands. Under his administration, tens of thousands of Dutch Jews were deported to concentration and extermination camps. Violent repression against civilians intensified. Hostages were executed as a form of intimidation, and in the final years of the war, the Dutch population faced one of the worst humanitarian crises of the conflict. The so-called Hunger Winter of 1944 left entire cities without food, fuel, and basic resources. During the trial, Seyss-Inquart tried to present himself as a rational administrator, someone who had merely carried out political functions within the structure of the Reich. But the evidence presented in Nuremberg showed his direct involvement in the repression and the deportations. Shortly before he was led to the scaffold, He entered a makeshift confessional inside the prison and received absolution from a Catholic priest. Then he walked to the gallows. Before the witnesses present, he spoke his final words. "I hope this execution will be the last act of the tragedy of the Second World War, and that the lesson learned from this war will be that peace and understanding must exist among peoples. I believe in Germany." They were long words for a man who had only a few seconds of life left. Moments later, the trapdoor opened. Arthur Seyss-Inquart became the last of the 10 men executed in Nuremberg. The fate of the bodies. After the executions were over, the bodies of the 10 condemned men, together with that of Hermann Göring, were removed from Nuremberg prison under heavy military guard. Everything was done in absolute secrecy. The corpses were placed in American army trucks and transported to Munich. Even after death, the Allies still feared that those men could become symbols for Nazi sympathizers scattered across Europe. For that reason, no ceremony would be allowed. The bodies were quietly cremated at a crematorium in the city of Munich, far from the press and the public. The ashes were collected by American military personnel and secretly scattered in the waters of the Isar River, a river that runs through the Bavaria region. The Allies wanted to prevent those men from continuing to exert influence even after death, so they erased their traces from the earth. The river carried away what remained of them, and in a way the fate of those men ended up reflecting what the Nazi regime itself tried to do to millions of other people during the war. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end. But before we wrap up, tell us what you thought of the content. Did you already know all those convicted at the Nuremberg Trials? Is there a specific name you would like us to cover in a future video? Feel free to leave a comment, because your opinion is essential to our work, all right? Do not forget to check that you are subscribed, turn on notifications so you are alerted whenever new content is posted, and leave a like to support our work. Take care and see you soon.